So I was just going to very quickly say a couple of things by way of introduction. There's been a bit of discussion around what a peace movement should be doing in this current situation. And I think in general, Scottish CND is part of a broader peace movement, and peace movement in any conflict usually is thinking about how to help end it. Now, obviously, it's up to the people of Ukraine. It's not up to us when they decide how to negotiate for peace, but we are responsible for our own government and its input into the situation, and can do what we can to try to help end the conflict by speaking both to government and maybe by person-to-person links. We can condemn violations of international law. We can think about how peace building could be supported. We can highlight the harms of the arms trade, and we can call out hate-stirring rhetoric, for example, demonising a whole people, not making the distinction between, say, President Putin and Russian people, because that kind of demonisation stokes hatred for future wars. And in terms of the international law, as well as the obvious invasion of Ukraine's national sovereignty and territory, the military actions have also broken various humanitarian rules of conflict. And indeed, most conflicts do break rules. And of course, we are in a state that has done that itself in various conflicts and has not always called out the breaking of those rules. But as a peace movement, we would always want to acknowledge that civilian populations are not supposed to be attacked. And since the 70s, there has been an explicit addition to the Geneva Conventions that actually requires governments who are war fighting not to target civilians and not to use threats of violence to terrorize civilians. And also there are, in that same protocol, things about not using starvation as a technique of war. And we, in the peace movement, in a peace movement that is a campaign for nuclear disarmament, we would always highlight the need to be very alert to the nuclear weapons and the way that they bring us to the brink of potential catastrophe. So, as a peace movement, Scottish CND are often walking alongside Stop the War, and we are part of, we're akin to, we're sort of like kindred spirits with the movement for the abolition of war. The founding chair of that movement was Bruce Kent. The current president of the movement for the abolition of war is Paul Rogers, who is speaking at the sequence of events that Scottish CND are involved in this coming week, co-hosted with SNP CND, Peace Education Scotland. And Paul Rogers, I will show a clip of, he was recently given the Cardinal Award, and I'll show a clip of that, maybe as well as Yuri speaking. So I'll now turn to the video of Yuri himself. So Yuri has made, I'm fantastically pleased that he's here, but he's made this very succinct video, which is also captioned, so helps us see his position very clearly. And Yuri's in a very difficult and dangerous situation, and is a very brave person speaking out as he does. And for Yuri's benefit, I just wanted to tell Yuri that as a campaign for nuclear disarmament here in Scotland, we are in the position of hosting the UK's nuclear weapons system, and we've been trying to highlight the ways in which the conflict in Ukraine brings the threat of nuclear war and the threat of catastrophe because of nuclear power stations in a conflict zone, and our own government's role in how we've got to here, because we have a government that is a nuclear state, a UK government that is a nuclear state, that has missed past opportunities to ban nuclear weapons, that has played its part in the nuclear rhetoric of the moment and in supporting the proliferation, at least in terms of modernisation of nuclear weapons, has continued to modernise its nuclear weapons and has used the conflict in Ukraine as part of an explanation for increasing nuclear weapons. Despite the fact that we now have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So we're also in a Scotland that has a Scottish government that is pledged to independence as a country, and if it became an independent country, to require the nuclear weapons to be removed from Scotland. And in that sense, we could become part of the beginning of the solution rather than part of the problem. And a nuclear-free independent Scotland would be signed up to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So with that context, I'm now going to show you yourself and play your video.
Dear friends, I am speaking from Kiev, capital of Ukraine, from my cold flat without heating. Luckily, I have electricity, but there are blackouts on other streets. Hard winter is ahead for Ukraine, as well as for the United Kingdom. Your government cuts your welfare to satisfy appetites of the arms industry and fuel bloodshed in Ukraine. And our army indeed continues a counteroffensive to regain Kherson. Artillery duels between Russian and Ukrainian armies endanger the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and a dam of Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, risking to cause radioactive leak and to sink tens of towns and villages. Our government avoids negotiation table. After 8 months of full-scale Russian invasion, thousands of deaths, recent shelling and attacks of kamikaze drones, with 40% of energetic infrastructure damaged and GDP decreased by half, when millions of people left homes to save their lives. This summer at the G7 summit, President Zelensky said that Ukraine needs more weapons to end the war before the winter. Zelensky also proposed a weird formula of peace, very similar to dystopian slogan "War is peace." NATO countries flooded Ukraine with avalanche of tools of mass murder. But here we are. The winter came and the war still drags on and on. No victory on horizon. President Putin also had plans to win by September. He was confident the invasion will go quickly and smoothly, but it was not realistic, and now he intensifies war effort instead of proper cessation. Contrary to empty promises of quick and total victory, experts warn the war is likely to last many years. This war already became a painful global problem. It caused stagflation of the world economy, exacerbated famine, and generated fears of nuclear apocalypse. By the way, nuclear escalation is a perfect example of the paradox of defense. You stockpile nukes to scare and restrain your rival. The enemy does the same. Then you warn each other that you will use the nukes without hesitation in retaliatory strike, according to mutually assured destruction doctrine. And then you exchange accusations in reckless threats. Then you feel that sitting on the mountain of bombs is a very precarious model of national security. And your security scares you. It is a paradox of security built on distrust instead of building mutual trust. Ukraine and Russia urgently need ceasefire and peace talks, and the West, engaged in the proxy war and economic war against Russia, must de-escalate and return to the negotiation table. But Zelensky signed a radical decree claiming impossibility to talk with Putin, and it is pity that Biden and Putin still avoid any contacts. Both sides portray each other as pure evil, which can't be trusted. But Black Sea Grain Initiative and recent exchanges of prisoners of war demonstrated the falseness of such propaganda. It is always possible to stop shooting and start talking. There are a lot of good plans how to end the war, including Minsk agreements, peace proposal of Ukraine given to Russian delegation during negotiations in Istanbul, proposals of mediation by United Nations and several heads of states. After all, the peace plan tweeted by Elon Musk, neutrality of Ukraine, self-determination of people on contested territories under UN supervision, and cessation of water blockade of Crimea. Global stagflation pushes entrepreneurs to participate in citizen diplomacy, like poor people and middle class, betrayed by warmongering political parties and trade unions, are joining the peace movement because of the cost of living crisis. I hope the peace movement could bring together people of different wealth and beliefs out of necessity to save the world from the scourge of war, to divest from the war machine, to invest into peace economy and sustainable development. Military-industrial complex owns the media and armies of high-profile liars. It obstructs and smears peace movements, but it could not silence or corrupt our conscience. And a lot of people in Russia and Ukraine are choosing a peaceful future by conscientious objection to military service, leaving their bloodthirsty fatherlands instead of participating in bloodshed. Peace lovers are frequently blamed in treason because of our loyalty to whole humankind. When you hear this pestering militarist nonsense, respond that we, the peace movements, are active everywhere. We expose the betrayal of peace, self-defeating dumbness and immorality of war on all sides across front lines. And this war will hopefully be stopped by the might of public opinion, by the power of sheer common sense. It may disappoint Putin and Zelensky. They may be forced to resign. But when you have a choice between common sense and saber-rattling dictator who tries to turn you into cannon fodder against your will and threatens to punish you for refusal to kill your fellow human beings, common sense should prevail over tyranny in civil resistance to war efforts. Sooner or later, common sense will prevail in democratic way or under pressure of unbearable pains of war. Merchants of death developed a long-term profitable strategy of their war of attrition. And the peace movement also has a long-term strategy to tell the truth, expose lies, teach peace, cherish hope, and work for peace tirelessly. But the most important part of our strategy is to empower public imagination, to show that the world without wars is possible. And if militarists dare to challenge this beautiful vision, the best reply are words of John Lennon. You may say, I am a dreamer, but I am not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one.
I spend a lot of my time on the African continent, in Asia, in Latin America, and the response to the conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, is curious. Cyril Ramaphosa, not a man of the left, not even a man of the center left, has said very plainly that this is a European conflict. South Africa doesn't want to take a position on it. South Africa has its own problems. He said that there are lots of conflicts on the African continent, some of them actually driven by European countries such as France, and the European countries are not made to take a position on them. Germany, for instance, hasn't taken a public position on the destruction of Mali by the intervention of France in Operation Barkhane 2013. I haven't at least seen a statement from German foreign ministry. India, Narendra Modi, a right-wing government close to the United States, he said, this is a European conflict. This conflict in Ukraine is about Europe. He said there are many problems in Asia, many problems indeed in South Asia, and European countries don't take a position on them. Why should we take a position on Europe? Why is Europe the center of the world? I think this is an interesting set of observations from Ramaphosa and Modi, and I think Europeans need to think about this. I covered the Iraq war for several years. I was in Fallujah, where depleted uranium was used against the public. I didn't see, Iraqi flags on social media posts in the West. Indeed, I didn't see such large-scale outrage for the destruction of Iraq. Almost 2 million people killed. In Ukraine, the numbers are nowhere near. When the United States started the war in Iraq, they bombed the entirety of Baghdad, destroying every state building, destroying the airport. The Russians are not fighting the war like that, and I can appreciate people being outraged by the Russian intervention and so on. Strikes people in places like Africa, Latin America, South Asia, different parts of Asia, strikes people there that there is a sense that Europe is pickled in hypocrisy, in a kind of European racist hypocrisy. And I would just like to put that on the table, not to take anything away from what anybody has said, but just to add to the conversation. I think that pickling and hypocrisy comes across at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was just held in Samarkand, where people criticized Mr. Putin. Modi criticized him, Xi Jinping criticized him, but they still negotiated and talked with him. Because after all, Mr. Putin is still the head of government of a country with 145 million people that has nuclear weapons. Xi Jinping's China knows you must negotiate with everybody. Narendra Modi's India knows you must negotiate with everybody. Seems to me the Europeans need to learn that lesson from some of these Asian leaders. It was all very well for the US to say we don't negotiate with the Taliban. At the same time, they were sitting in Doha, Qatar, negotiating with the Taliban. A very strange attitude. The US has close relations with Saudi Arabia, which is not even a pretend democracy. And yet they are terrified of talking to Mr. Putin. Very strange attitude. All of that is highly visible in the capitals of the global south. Look, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, Fiona Hill, who you in Great Britain, exported to the United States, she became an advisor to Mr. Trump. Fiona Hill has an article in the September-October issue of Foreign Affairs where she says and confirms, because suspicions of this had been there earlier, that in April of this year, Mr. Zelensky's government and Mr. Putin's government came to an interim agreement in April of this year, early April. And then what happened? Then that great swashbuckler humanitarian with the wonderful hair, Boris Johnson, your former prime minister, dances into Kiev, walks the streets of Kiev with Zelensky, quiet, empty streets, and tells Zelensky in his ear that the West is not going to permit a peace agreement with Russia. Zelensky then breaks the interim agreement and says, we will never negotiate with Russia. My friends, that was in early April. We are now in September. An entire propaganda machine has gone into place saying Russia is not willing to negotiate. Indeed, they even say that Russia is an unreliable actor. Let me tell you.
So then he goes on to complain about unreliable actors. But I mean, I'm not. I think that's interesting to hear. But I would also say, of course, two wrongs never make a right, as my mother would have said. So citing harms that other people have done doesn't excuse any other harms. But have I stopped sharing my screen?
No, you still need to stop sharing.
Right.
That's it.
Good. Good. Okay, so now it's over to you and to Yuri to come into this discussion. So we have a good half hour for a more open discussion of the issues and what we can be doing in Scotland, and in the context of having passed a resolution at AGM suggesting that Scottish CND should discuss with key politicians in Scotland about how to try to encourage negotiated settlements and international agreements, and also taking action perhaps with Stop the War or other organisations and producing relevant information. But it's for Yuri to maybe see if there's anything else he wants to say, and for you to have questions for Yuri.
I would like to ask, can we make it not half an hour, but hour? Because I have something to say like for a half an hour.
No, basically the answer to that is no. I'm sorry, Yuri. You have to say it more concisely. But let me invite some questions first for you, and then.
Okay. If I will add very shortly to what I spoke in this video. I must add that first of all, war in Ukraine, like nuclear weapons, is clear evidence that structural violence in current international system went so utterly wrong that the international system could not be repaired without fundamental structural changes focused on universal, non-violent enforcement of individual and collective right to peace. We must be ready to go far enough for reconsidering old sacred delusion of sovereignty. And when I'm saying delusion, I mean it. Any sovereignty, either private or public, is dangerous legal fiction, implying someone could have absolute power to harm anybody, supposedly for security of sovereign interests. Absolute power is an unrealistic idea, and its pursuit is dangerous both for ambitious aspirers and for victims of their ambitions. If we are serious about common security, we must rethink all aspired sovereignties with respect to limits of aspired power, with strong commitment to not harm nature, others, and ourselves. Thinking about ourselves in terms of solidarity with others and with nature, not in terms of alienated and violent identities. Only aspiration of reasonable power or autonomy lead humankind to peace, and any pursuit of absolute power or sovereignty is leading to just in opposite direction. When Supreme Court of your country decides that local self-governments could not hold consultative referendums about their powers without consent of sovereign parliament in the capital, it shows that sovereignty is still undemocratic as in the past. But nuclear weapons is more vivid. It is the best example of absurdity and undemocratic character of sovereignty. When you use ready-to-use nuclear weapons, it is destruction of people. People should be power, democracy, but nuclear weapons is anti-human. It is undemocratic by definition. When a power to destroy all life on earth is proclaimed as national interests, as guarantee of sovereignty, it is absurd. Democracy and violence are not compatible, and democracy is not just so-called violent majority rule. It is culture of dialogue and compromise between the will of majority and rights of minorities, individuals, and nature. And it is very important to understand that. It is my first point. And another point is this. that conventional thinking about peace in Ukraine, which dominates mainstream media, is based on the idea of military support of Ukraine to defeat Russia. How unrealistic could seem the idea of victory in the war with a state which possesses one of the greatest arsenals of weapons of mass destruction on the planet? Warmongering pundits say that we should not give up to nuclear blackmail. Western leaders sent a lot of signals to Putin, threatening him with horrific consequences if he resort to nuclear strike. In response, he started to level Ukrainian energetics. Perhaps it is his way to show he is also not giving up to blackmail. It would be a shame if the war will be escalated to degree of nuclear strikes after reckless risk-taking under the slogan of not giving up to nuclear threats. Utter recklessness we observed during artillery duels between Ukraine and Russia, endangering the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. International Atomic Energy Agency done a lot to demilitarize it, and there are signs that Russia could abandon it in exchange of unimpeded oil transfer to London. Also, initiatives of civil unarmed protection of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant proposed by my friend John River is a very interesting idea. By the way, Spanish professor Felipe Daza published a report about nonviolent civil resistance to Russian invasion. It is a very interesting document, and it documents under-recognized, under-reported, and under-supported tendency, because the state just not supports enough non-violent action. All efforts are taken into waging war. This strategy of defeating Russia has very unpleasant implications. Instead of a horrible end in the nuclear war, the world could come to the horror of protracted war without the end. Influential American think tank Atlantic Council recently published a paper calling to reject any ceasefire proposals unless Russia fully withdraw troops and turn Ukraine into a military fortress modeled after Israel. This strategy implies that even after victory of Ukraine and recapturing of all occupied territories, it would be necessary to support Ukrainian readiness for further Russian invasions, which could happen anytime. It is almost clear, it admits that planned victory is just preparation for the next war. It is clear demonstrations that we need structural changes. And President Putin and President Zelensky too plan wage their war for decades. Putin revealed his intention to continue war for 21 years, if necessary, when he compared himself with Peter the Great and his war with Great Northern War. And President Zelensky initially said he is ready to fight for victory 10 years. It was an interview to BBC, as I remember. And then recently at G20 summit, Zelensky advocated so-called Kiev Security Compact, which says that all civilians in Ukraine must be turned into soldiers, and Ukrainian defensive war will need multi-decade supply of Western weapons. This idea of victory is just another name for war without end. And that's why we need to put our efforts into development of non-violent way of life. To stop the war, we need ceasefire and peace talks without preconditions. We need to advocate peace. We need to teach and learn peace, and we need to invest into peace. That is approach which gives hope. Victory is a hopeless pursuit of endless war. Non-violence, human rights defense of conscientious objectors to military service, peace education is a hope for a better future.
Sure.
And of course, abolition of nuclear weapons.
Can I pause you and let's see if let's let people ask you things, because there will be people who probably wanting very desperately to ask you something. Kat?
So Jan Benvey is interested to learn a little more about the peace movement in the Ukraine specifically.
I mean, are you alone, Yuri, or is there? Can you tell us about what support you have, what the peace movement looks like in Ukraine?
Oh, you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Sorry, I am turning on my mic. Yeah, I represent Ukrainian Pacifist movement. We are a small group of enthusiasts focused on advocacy of peace by peaceful means and conscientious objection to military service. We think about ourselves as a small group representing large social tendency. People need peace and avoid participation in bloodshed. But the idea of peace in Ukraine is stigmatized by propaganda of war. Civil society is poisoned by hate and militarism. Ukrainian pacifist movement was founded in 2019 during protests against cruel military draft, police raids, abductions, and detainment of young people at the streets. We had meetings and worked for peace. Also, we organized several peace education events. We joined international networks of peace movement. And by the way, in this networks such as War Resisters International, we co-participate with Russian friends. For example, in War Resisters International, there is a Russian movement of conscientious objectors. I participated several times in their online meetings, and there is serious problems because in Russia you could be easily imprisoned or fined with very high fine for any protest against the war and for a refusal to serve in army. Also, in another international network, International Peace Bureau, which calls for Christmas ceasefire. I saw this call for Christmas ceasefire at your website, and I strongly encourage you to sign this appeal for Christmas ceasefire idea based on fraternization between opposite trenches during the First World War. I think it is great appeal to try to repeat it. So in International Peace Bureau, there is Russian feminist anti-war resistance, and there is ecological organization from St. Petersburg, led by long-standing anti-nuclear activist Oleg Bodrov, and unfortunately his organization was proclaimed foreign agent, which means that he basically was forced to curtail most of legal activities, but he continues to advocate peace, of course, even facing this this challenging restrictions and repressions. Also, this year we adopted statements condemning Russian invasion. We had several online meetings, as I said. We are permanently calling for diplomatic solutions, writing petitions, receiving interesting answers. You know, Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights wrote to us that advocacy of conscientious objection to military service is a threat to national security, and because of that they wrote to Security Service of Ukraine asking them to deal with us, and of course we complained on this manifestly false crime report. To honor of security service, they didn't take any action, at least yet. But let's see. Of course, we are disappointed and worrying about this move when National Human Rights Institution is persecuting human rights defenders and advocates of peace. And if the officials doing such things, of course, there are also informal pressure, trolls in social networks, you know, scary phone calls at night. Anyway, if you advocate peace in belligerent country, you should be prepared to do it 24/7.
Thank you. Can I just, I'm encouraging people to put things in the chat, but also that's not to stop you actually directly asking questions at all. I'm just mindful of trying to encourage you to ask questions, and we maybe won't have many chances to speak to Yuri, so I think it's quite important that you get a chance to ask anything that you might want to know or directly ask. We'll certainly make this talk available, and the video that I showed is already widely available, but we can put the URL for it. I think it's probably already in our Ukraine-Russia hub. Kat, do you want to just say something about that?
Yeah, the video's not in the hub yet, but we have a webpage on the Scottish CND website, which is Ukraine-Russia kind of info hub is what we're calling it. And it's basically a kind of response to misinformation in the media, and a place where we're bringing together resources from the peace movement on the situation in Ukraine and giving, I guess, an alternative stance. So we'll have a frequently asked questions section, you know, or I guess there'll be standard myths that you see a lot in the media that we'll be responding to, either resources from Scottish CND ourselves or also wider. So this event itself, the recording will be available on that following this meeting. I'll put that up this week, and I will just share that in the chat right now. We have a question from Jean, I think.
Yes, Jean, do you want to ask your question directly, or do you want me to read it out for you? Go on and ask it. Go for it.
Yuri, I was interested in what you were saying, very much so. I'd like to know if you personally are in any danger, or your friends, because of what you do for peace. Are you in danger of being arrested or harassed by official people or anything like that?
Thank you, Jean.
Yes, as I said, this letter from National Human Rights Institution to Security Service of Ukraine is recent very worrying tendency, but we still don't know whether it resulted in anything. They could just use this as pretext to, you know, to intercept phone calls and so on. One of co-founders of Ukrainian Pacifist movement, Ruslan Katsaba, was imprisoned for his 2015 YouTube video calling to boycott military mobilization. He was charged in treason and obstruction of military affairs, spent in prison 524 days. Amnesty International proclaimed him prisoner of conscience, and he was became worldwide famous before creation of our organization. I invited him to become a president when this idea to found Ukrainian Pacifist movement came to several people, and after creation of our organization, shameful retrial in case of Ruslan Kotsaba continued. Interesting story of this retrial, because appellate court acquitted Ruslan. And then higher court quashed this acquittal under pressure from right-wing circles. They came to court. Some people even took weapons, and they openly said to journalists that if the court will not punish traitor Kotsaba, they will resort to direct action. So the court quashed acquittal, and then during several years, Ruslan went to court of first instance, and every time when he came here, the court was surrounded by right-wing crowds, shouting, throwing things. Once they just poured on him a brilliant green chemical and damaged his eye. They attacked his lawyers, they attacked his relatives, and at last court decided to hold hearings online. Then it changed several months ago, and Ruslan was so bullied and fearing for his life and liberty that he found a way to leave Ukraine. He done it legally, supporting his disabled mother to healing in Europe, and then he went to United States to seek asylum, because once he was mentioned in a report on religious freedom by the State Department, and based on that he hoped for asylum in the United States. Another examples, our member Yurii Sheliazhenko, follower of Leo Tolstoy. He is TikToker, and he published a video calling for peace talks and substantiating ideas that no territories are worthy so cruel bloodshed. And some people, some military people came to his home and they threatened to bury him, but he was not there because to be not drafted to army, he went abroad, and now he lives and works in Hungary. And there is situation with Vitaly Alexeyenko. He was sentenced for 1 year of prison for his refusal to be mobilized to army and refusal to repent in the court. He thinks he acted as decent Christian and done nothing wrong. He believes in teachings of Jesus Christ concerning resistance to evil without violence and overcoming enmity with love and peacemaking. And the court just was furious that he was not repent. Mostly sentenced conscientious objectors are ready to formally admit their guilt. But Vitaly said, I will not repent, and he obtained this real prison term. When people formally admit their guilt, they receive probation, which means that you should go to probation authority every month, and they will try, you know, to change you, to convince you that it is just war and you should come to army.
Yuri, can I just get you, there's another question waiting for you, but can I just get you to explain, the military service is not compulsory, is it? I mean, I know that men were not allowed to leave, but to what extent is military service compulsory? Could you explain that, please? I know that men are not allowed to leave Ukraine in a certain age group. That happened very early on. But to what extent is military service compulsory?
Military service is compulsory for all men and some women. In particular,
always, or just in conflict, in this conflict, or is a normal part of being a Ukrainian citizen, or what?
All male Ukrainian citizens are subject to military duty. There are some age limitations, like you should be registered to military service in age of 17, just registered, and then from age 18 you could be drafted. Draft formally is universal, but there are plans, and after these plans are done, hunting for draftees is basically hunting for bribes. You know, they are recruiting officers more interested in people who are ready to give bribe for not be called to army than actually to conscript people more than some plan prescribes. And in peacetime, there some arrangement for conscientious objectors was prescribed by the law of 1991 on alternative non-military service. But only for formal members of some religious organizations, very small religious organizations. Now, under martial law, conscientious objection to military service is outlawed. It is not recognized. Alternative service is not accessible, and it is contrary to international human rights law, because Article 18 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says about freedom of conscience, and the United Nations Committee on Human Rights in General Comment 22 said that it includes right to conscientious objection to military service, including in time of war. And in time of war, it is especially important. I know experience in UK. In UK, this right mostly was advocated precisely in time of war. And of course, when the state can't defend such basic human rights and instead are trying to portray conscientious objectors as traitors, despite in any country during any war there is conscientious objectors. It is just not democratic state.
Yeah, thank you, Yuri. Jonathan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, surely. Firstly, quickly to say how much I support what you're saying and your incredible bravery, what you're doing. And I think that too many people, at the end, what you're saying there, I mean, rights are being destroyed in Russia, but they're also being destroyed in Ukraine. And increasingly, they're even being destroyed in this country. Is there any way that you could receive any financial support? That might be impractical, but is there any way? And if not, you don't have to let us know now, but if you could, then please send that my way.
It is a little bit complicated. Currently, some expenses, like legal expenses for defense of conscientious objectors, or some expenses concerning our work, like correspondence and so on, or gadgets on which I work, gadgets with big battery needed during these blackouts. I buy it for, you know, some not donations, because I am working on establishment of legal person. It is complicated in Ukrainian law to create something something good for peace movement. Our laws encouraging to do it not this way. But anyway, I can receive, for example, some honorarium for speech and could use it for peace movement. Also, our friends in Italy and Germany are working on support and advocacy of conscientious objection, asylum for conscientious objectors, and so on. And I could give you links to fundraising of our friends in Germany, which is Connection EV, International Network for Support of Conscientious Objectors and Deserters, and to Italian organization Movimento Non Violenta. It is a prominent anti-war and war-resisting community. They publish a journal, Azione Non Violenta. In translation, it is Nonviolent Action. So through these organizations, you could support us. They're helping Ukrainian pacifist movement and also Russian pacifist movement of conscientious objectors too.
Okay.
Can you email me those, Yuri? I think you should have my email address, because then I can publish them on the website.
Okay. Also maybe I will put it into chat.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So we're just about out of time. Can I just check if there is any other final questions or comments, particularly from people who've not managed to speak or come in yet? Can I see? No. Okay. Well. Great. Yeah, I know we will stop at 7 because we promised to do that. Yuri, thank you very, very much for joining us. We will launch you in a conventional way. Thank you so much. And we're wishing you good health and a safe future. And we hope the conflict will end very soon.
And I am very grateful to Scottish campaign for nuclear disarmament and for all who attended today, for your interest and for your work for the world free of nuclear weapons and for the world without wars.